What prophecy Hitler ignored before the collapse? In the final years of World War II, as the Third Reich began to crumble, many wondered, did Adolf Hitler see it coming? Or did he ignore the warnings, the prophecies that predicted Germany's downfall? Because long before Berlin fell in 1945, signs of collapse were already clear, and some voices had warned him. 1. The warning from his own generals. One of the strongest prophecies came not from mystics, but from experienced military commanders. In 1941, before launching Operation Barbarossa, several German officers warned that invading the Soviet Union would lead to disaster. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and others believed Germany could not sustain a prolonged war on two fronts. Germany was already fighting Britain in the West. Opening a massive Eastern Front against the Soviet Union would stretch supply lines beyond their limits. But Hitler ignored these warnings. He believed destiny was on his side. 2. The Russian Winter Prophecy. When German troops advanced toward Moscow in late 1941, some commanders warned about the brutal Russian winter. History had already shown what winter could do. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte had suffered catastrophic losses during his invasion of Russia. Generals reminded Hitler of this historical lesson. They feared frozen equipment, broken supply lines, exhausted troops. But Hitler dismissed concerns. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse before winter. It didn't. Instead, the German army froze, literally and strategically. 3. The economic collapse warning. Germany's war economy was under immense strain by 1943. Industrial experts warned that Allied bombing campaigns were destroying critical infrastructure. The air raids on factories, railways, and oil facilities were devastating. Despite this, Hitler insisted on continuing massive offensives. He rejected defensive strategies that might have preserved resources. It was another ignored warning, another step toward collapse. 4. The Fortress Europe Illusion. Before D-Day in 1944, some German commanders warned that the Atlantic Wall defenses were not strong enough. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed the Allies must be stopped directly on the beaches. If they gained a foothold, Germany would not be able to push them back. He urged stronger coastal defenses and faster armored deployment. But internal disagreements in Hitler's centralized control delayed key decisions. When the Allies landed in Normandy, hesitation proved fatal. The prophecy became reality. 5. The warning of total war fatigue. By late 1944, Germany faced shortages of fuel, inexperienced teenage soldiers, civilians exhausted by bombing. Some advisors privately acknowledged the war was lost, but Hitler refused negotiation. He believed in final victory even when Berlin was surrounded. He ignored political reality, and in doing so, sealed Germany's fate. 6. The supernatural prophecies. Beyond military warnings, there were also mystical elements in Nazi leadership circles. Astrologers and occult advisors were occasionally consulted. Some accounts suggest that predictions of defeat were dismissed or suppressed. However, Hitler relied more on ideology than prophecy. His true, ignored prophecy wasn't mystical. It was strategic. It was practical. It was repeated, and it came from his own commanders. 7. The collapse becomes inevitable. By early 1945, the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. Western allies crossed the Rhine. German cities lay in ruins. The warnings had all come true. Berlin was encircled. And on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker. The collapse was complete. 8. The real prophecy. The prophecy Hitler ignored was simple. No nation can fight the world alone. Overconfidence, ideological blindness, refusal to adapt. These were the true warnings. History does not collapse in one moment. It collapses after many ignored signs. 9. the generals who knew it was over. After the failure at Stalingrad in 1943, many senior officers understood something critical. Germany could not win a war of attrition. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein argued for strategic withdrawals to shorten defensive lines. He believed preserving manpower was more important than symbolic territory. But Hitler refused. He issued his infamous no-retreat orders. Entire armies were trapped and destroyed because withdrawal was forbidden. The prophecy was clear. Rigid command would destroy flexibility, and flexibility wins wars. 10. The Stalingrad turning point. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was a warning. General Friedrich Paulus requested permission to break out when Soviet forces encircled his Sixth Army. Hitler denied it. He promised air resupply. It failed. Over 250,000 German soldiers were trapped. Most never returned. After Stalingrad, even loyal commanders privately admitted the war had turned. But Hitler still believed in miracle reversals. 11. The assassination attempt. On July 20, 1944, a group of German officers attempted to kill Hitler in what became known as the July 20th plot. They believed removing him was the only way to save Germany from destruction. The bomb failed. Hitler survived. But the message was undeniable. Even his own officers believed his leadership would destroy the nation. Instead of reconsidering strategy, Hitler responded with paranoia and executions. Another warning ignored. 12. The Battle of the Bulge. Gamble. In late 1944, Hitler launched one last major offensive, the Ardennes counterattack, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Many generals warned Germany lacked fuel, lacked reserves, lacked air superiority. But Hitler believed a surprise victory would split Allied forces and force negotiations. Initially, the attack shocked the Allies, but within weeks, it collapsed. Germany had wasted its last strategic reserves. After this, defeat was only a matter of time. 13. Inside the bunker. By April 1945, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler still issued orders to divisions that no longer existed. He demanded counterattacks from ghost armies. Reality had completely separated from command. Even loyal officials like Joseph Goebbels saw the end approaching. Yet no surrender was allowed. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life. The prophecy of collapse had finally come true. 14. The psychological blind spot. Why were the warnings ignored? Because Hitler believed destiny protected him. His intuition was superior to experts. Retreat was weakness. Overconfidence turned into denial. Denial turned into disaster. 15. The true meaning of the prophecy. There was no single mystical prediction. The real prophecy was repeated by history itself. Overextension leads to collapse. Ideology without strategy leads to ruin. And leaders who silence criticism doom themselves. Germany did not fall overnight. It fell after years of ignored warnings. 16. The Red Army at the gates. The Soviet Red Army was closing in from the east. Marshal Georgy Zhukov led a massive assault toward Berlin. German defenses were collapsing street by street. Teenage soldiers from the Hitler Youth were sent to fight tanks. Old men were given rifles. Germany had run out of trained manpower. The prophecy of overextension had reached its final chapter. 17. Orders to non-existent armies. Inside the bunker, Hitler still moved imaginary divisions across maps. He ordered General Felix Steiner to launch a counterattack. But Steiner's forces were exhausted and too small. The attack never happened. When Hitler learned this, he exploded in rage. For the first time, he admitted the war was lost. But even then, surrender was unthinkable to him. 18. The civilian catastrophe. Berlin's civilians suffered immensely. Bombed-out neighborhoods. No electricity. No clean water. constant artillery fire. Millions across Germany faced starvation and displacement. Yet the leadership continued to speak of final victory. The gap between propaganda and reality had never been wider. 19. The final refusal. Several officials suggested negotiation, but Hitler refused any idea of surrender. He believed Germany had failed him, not the other way around. In his final political testament, he blamed generals, politicians, and even the German people for defeat. The pattern was clear. The prophecy had been ignored until there was nothing left to save. April 20th, 1945. As Soviet troops fought only blocks away, Adolf Hitler remained in his underground bunker. On April 30th, he took his own life. A 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12 years. The collapse was complete. 21. The lesson of the ignored warning. The prophecy was never mystical. It was strategic reality. It was ignoring supply limits, fighting too many enemies, refusing tactical retreat, silencing dissent. Again and again, experienced commanders warned of disaster. Again and again, those warnings were dismissed, and history does not forgive denial. 22. The bigger picture. The fall of Nazi Germany was not sudden. It was predictable. From the moment Germany invaded the Soviet Union, from the moment it declared war on the United States, from the moment it chose ideology over strategy, the countdown had begun. The prophecy of collapse was written years before Berlin burned. 23. The cost of ignored reality. By the end of the war, Germany was divided and occupied. Millions were dead. Cities were destroyed. The Nazi leadership was gone. What remained was devastation. The warnings had always been there. Do not fight a war on multiple fronts. Do not underestimate your enemies. Do not ignore logistics and supply. Do not silence experienced commanders. But those lessons were dismissed in favor of ideology. 24. The trials that followed. After the war, surviving Nazi leaders were put on trial in what became known as the Nuremberg trials. The trials exposed the inner workings of the regime. Documents revealed strategic miscalculations. 25. The myth of destiny. Hitler often spoke of destiny and fate. He believed Germany's victory was inevitable. But war does not follow destiny. It follows supply lines. It follows strategy. It follows adaptability. When leaders believe they are chosen by history, they stop listening to reality. And that is when collapse begins. 26. The real prophecy. The prophecy Hitler ignored was not spoken by fortune tellers. It was spoken by logistics officers warning about fuel shortages, generals warning about overstretched lines, economists warning about industrial collapse, history itself reminding him of past invasions that failed. The warning was clear. No empire can fight the world and survive. 27. A universal lesson. This story is not only about Germany, it is about leadership, about pride, about refusing to admit mistakes. When power is centralized in one voice and dissent is silenced, reality eventually forces its own correction. 29. The trap of absolute power. When one man controls, the army, the state, the propaganda, the decision-making, there are no filters. No one can challenge him. Adolf Hitler had eliminated political rivals long before the war began. By 1944, most generals feared contradicting him. And when leaders stop hearing criticism, they stop seeing reality. 30. The no-retreat obsession. Hitler believed retreat meant weakness. He issued strict hold-your-ground orders, even when withdrawal was strategically necessary. In contrast, leaders like Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt listened to advisors, adjusted strategies, and accepted tactical retreats when needed. Flexibility saved the Allies. Rigidity trapped Germany. 31. Ideology over strategy. Hitler's decisions were increasingly ideological rather than military. Instead of focusing purely on battlefield reality, he prioritized symbolic victories. Cities were defended to the last man, even when strategically useless. Resources were wasted on revenge weapons instead of strengthening defense. The prophecy was simple. When ideology replaces strategy, defeat accelerates. 32. Isolation in the bunker. As Berlin collapsed, Hitler became physically and mentally isolated. Inside the bunker, information was filtered, reports were softened, reality was delayed. He surrounded himself with loyalists rather than critics. And when a leader builds walls around truth, those walls become a prison. 33. The pattern of history. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Overconfidence, expansion, overstretch, denial, collapse. Napoleon faced it. Other empires faced it. Germany followed the same path. The prophecy was not unique. It was historical repetition. 34. The final ignored truth. By early 1945, even children understood Germany could not win. Yet official speeches still promised miracles. The truth had become dangerous. And when truth becomes dangerous, collapse becomes unavoidable. 35. The numbers didn't lie. By late 1944, the United States was producing more aircraft than Germany could destroy. The Soviet Union was fielding millions of soldiers on the Eastern Front. Allied bombing had crippled oil production. Germany was fighting industrial giants. Even brilliant tactics could not overcome overwhelming production power. The prophecy was written in factories, not in fortune. 36. The oil crisis. Modern war runs on fuel. By 1944, Germany's access to oil was collapsing. Synthetic fuel plants were bombed. Romanian oil fields were lost. Panzer divisions had tanks, but often no fuel to move them. Without fuel, even the most powerful army becomes static, and static armies lose wars. 37. The two-front nightmare. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, he created a war on two massive fronts. This was the same mistake that had haunted Germany in World War I. Strategists had long warned Germany could not survive a prolonged two-front war, yet ideology pushed forward anyway. Once the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Germany faced three industrial superpowers. The prophecy was clear. Overextension equals collapse. 38. The collapse of morale. By 1945, soldiers were exhausted. Civilians were hopeless. Officers were divided. Even propaganda could not hide the truth anymore. The myth of invincibility had shattered. When morale collapses, structure soon follows. 39. The final days. As Soviet forces stormed Berlin, led by Georgy Zhukov, resistance became symbolic rather than strategic. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler ended his life. Days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. 40. The real prophecy revealed. The prophecy Hitler ignored was not mystical, it was structural. No nation can fight the world, ignore supply limits, silence internal criticism, replace strategy with ideology, and expect to survive. The collapse of the Third Reich was not fate, it was consequence. Empires do not fall because enemies are strong. They fall because leaders believe they cannot fail. Hitler ignored the warnings of history, and history answered back. 41. A nation divided. After the fall of Berlin, Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France. Soon the country split into East and West Germany. The collapse of the Third Reich reshaped Europe for decades. The ignored warnings had not only destroyed an empire, they had reshaped the world order. 42. The Cold War begins. As Soviet forces expanded influence in Eastern Europe, tensions grew between former allies. Leaders like Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill entered a new geopolitical struggle. Churchill famously described an iron curtain descending across Europe. The collapse of Nazi Germany did not bring lasting peace. It opened the door to the Cold War, another unintended consequence of ignored limits in total war. 43. The human reckoning. The world soon uncovered the full horrors of the Holocaust. The scale of destruction shocked humanity. The regime that had promised national greatness had delivered devastation. The prophecy ignored was not just military, it was moral. When leadership abandons humanity, collapse is not only political, it is ethical. 44. The pattern that repeats. History scholars often point out a repeating pattern: rapid expansion, overconfidence, suppression of dissent, strategic overreach, collapse. The Third Reich followed this exact path, not because of destiny, but because of decisions. 46. The illusion of invincibility. In the early years of the war, Germany seemed unstoppable. Poland fell quickly. France collapsed in weeks. Europe appeared conquered. Success created a dangerous illusion: invincibility. And invincibility breeds risk. When early victories go unchallenged, leaders begin believing they cannot lose. That belief is often the beginning of downfall. 47. The cost of silencing doubt. Healthy leadership allows disagreement. Strong systems allow debate. But in Nazi Germany, disagreement was dangerous. Generals who questioned strategy were removed. Political opponents were eliminated. Fear replaced honest analysis. And when fear replaces truth, reality becomes invisible. 48. When strategy becomes personal. As the war turned against Germany, decisions became less strategic and more emotional. Battles were fought for pride. Cities were defended for symbolism. Orders were issued to preserve image rather than advantage. War became personal, and personal wars rarely end rationally. 49. The collapse was predictable. By 1943, military experts across the world knew Germany faced overwhelming odds: the industrial power of the United States, the manpower of the Soviet Union, the resilience of Britain. The outcome was becoming predictable. But denial can delay acceptance. It cannot stop consequences. 50. The prophecy defined. So what was the prophecy Hitler ignored? It was this: no regime built on fear, overreach, and ideology can outlast reality. Empires collapse when expansion exceeds resources, leadership ignores limits, pride blocks adaptation, and in the end, reality always wins. 51. The broader warning. This story is not only about 1945, it is about leadership in every era. History whispers the same warning again and again. Listen to criticism, respect limits, adapt to change, or face collapse. Final, ultimate closing line for your video. The prophecy was never hidden. It was written in history books. It was spoken by generals. It was visible in the numbers. But it was ignored. And when prophecy becomes reality, there is no turning back. In the ruins of Berlin, the world learned a lesson written in fire and steel. Power without restraint destroys itself. History had warned. The generals had warned. The numbers had warned. But the warnings were ignored. And when warnings are ignored long enough, they become history. The prophecy Hitler ignored was not mystical. It was structural. No nation can fight the world, ignore supply limits, silence internal criticism, replace strategy with ideology, and expect to survive. The collapse of the Third Reich was not fate, it was consequence. The prophecy Hitler ignored was not mystical, it was human. It was strategic reality. It was history repeating itself. And when reality is denied long enough, it doesn't disappear. It returns with consequences. The collapse of the Third Reich was dramatic, but it was not sudden. It was the final chapter of years of ignored warnings. The prophecy had always been there. It was written in frozen Russian fields, in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the skies over Normandy, in the streets of Berlin. And when April 1945 arrived, the prophecy was fulfilled. Final cinematic closing line for your video. History does not whisper forever. It warns, it repeats. And when those warnings are ignored, collapse becomes inevitable.